Drake Cole, the youngest CEO ever to appear on the cover of a financial magazine, was betrayed and lost everything in one night. The city of Manhattan roared around him as if nothing had changed. Cars pushed through sheets of rain, their headlights splintering into fractured diamonds on the slick asphalt. Neon signs blinked with relentless cheer. Towering billboards screamed about luxury watches and five-star resorts. And the whole metropolis seemed alive with a rhythm that excluded him entirely. For Drake, the lights were daggers. Each flash of brilliance was another reminder of who he had been only hours ago, a man who owned the night, who bent markets with a word, who could summon investors across continents with a single phone call. Now he was just a figure slouched in the rain, another shadow moving along the crowded street. He hadn't planned to walk home. Truthfully, he hadn't planned anything. After the meeting, after the final signatures scrawled across the papers that stripped his name from Cole Group, his legs had simply carried him out into the storm. The rain had swallowed him whole, plastering his hair to his forehead, soaking through his tailored suit until the expensive fabric clung like a shroud. Every drop felt like a punishment, a judgment he couldn't escape. The betrayal had been perfect in its cruelty. Cassandra, his wife, his partner in every headline, the woman the press had called the queen to his empire, had stood across from him with icy detachment. Beside her was Victor Hale, his own lawyer, the man Drake had trusted with his fortune and his future. Together they had dismantled him in minutes. Cole Group, the empire he had built from nothing, was no longer his. His reputation, his wealth, his carefully cultivated legacy, gone. Cassandra hadn't even bothered with theatrics. No screaming, no grand declarations, only a parting shot, her voice cool and sharp as glass. "You were always too naive, Drake. That's why you'll never survive in a world like this." The words cut deeper than the loss itself. He stumbled now, boots splashing through puddles, eyes fixed on nothing. Around him, umbrellas bobbed like black domes, strangers rushed to avoid the storm, taxis hissed through the flooded gutters. No one spared him a second glance. Invisible. Drake Cole, once the golden prodigy of Wall Street, now nothing more than a man drowning in plain sight. A massive screen on the side of a building caught his attention. His own face stared back at him, frozen in triumph from a year-old cover of Fortune. Below it, bold letters screamed, "Billionaire falls from grace, Cole Group in turmoil." He stopped, staring at the cruel juxtaposition. The crowd around him pressed forward, some pausing just long enough to glance at the disgraced mogul without realizing the man himself stood only feet away. A few even laughed at the headline before hurrying on, their umbrellas bobbing against the storm. Drake's jaw tightened. He turned away, but the weight of the image clung to him. Once he had believed he was untouchable. That belief had been his downfall. The rain intensified, a heavy curtain that blurred the city into streaks of light and shadow. Drake shoved his hands into his soaked pockets and lowered his head, the collar of his coat useless against the downpour. His mind reeled with memories. The first deal he had ever closed, the pride in his father's eyes before the man passed away, the nights of endless strategy meetings, the sacrifices he had justified in the name of success. What had it been for? A hollow empire. A wife who had seen him as a stepping stone. A life measured in stock tickers and headlines, all of it devoured in a single evening. His chest ached, not just from the betrayal, but from the crushing emptiness that followed. For the first time in his adult life, there was no plan, no next step, no empire to rebuild. Only silence and rain. He drifted past glowing storefronts, past people ducking under awnings, past a violinist trying to protect his instrument from the storm. Somewhere along the way, Drake realized he had wandered into a quieter part of the city. The skyscrapers still loomed, but the streets narrowed, the neon dimmed, and the rhythm of the city slowed. That was when he saw it. A small cafe, its windows fogged from the warmth inside. Golden light spilled onto the sidewalk, a soft contrast to the cold silver of the storm. For a moment Drake stopped and stared. The sight tugged at something inside him, something fragile, almost forgotten. He considered stepping in just for a moment of warmth, but the thought twisted bitterly in his chest. What did it matter? A cup of coffee couldn't fix a shattered empire. A warm chair couldn't erase Cassandra's words. No, he told himself. He didn't deserve warmth. Not anymore. He turned away, shoulders hunched, ready to let the storm consume him again. But before he could take another step, a voice cut through the rain. "Hey," it said softly, almost hesitant. Drake blinked, turning. There she was, a young woman, small in stature, standing a few feet away with an umbrella tilted against the storm. Her coat was old, the kind that had seen too many winters, and her shoes were already damp from the puddles. But her eyes, warm, steady brown eyes, met his without hesitation. "Looks like you could use some help." For a long moment, Drake just stared. No one had spoken to him like that in years, not as a CEO, not as a billionaire, not as a fallen icon, just as a man drenched and broken in the rain. His lips parted, a bitter laugh threatening to escape, but no words came. The storm raged on around them, indifferent. And in that fragile pause, Drake Cole realized that his story, whatever it would become, was about to change. For a moment, Drake said nothing. The rain lashed against his skin, plastering his hair to his forehead, but all he could focus on was the young woman standing before him. She didn't look away, didn't shift uncomfortably the way others did when they recognized his face on the headlines. Her gaze was steady, unassuming, almost stubborn in its kindness. "I'm fine," Drake muttered hoarsely, though the words tasted like ash. Fine? He was anything but fine. The woman tilted the umbrella further, covering more of him than herself. Her shoulders were already damp, raindrops clinging to the loose strands of her hair, yet she didn't seem to care. "You don't look fine," she said softly. "Come on, there's a cafe right here. At least get out of the rain for a while." Drake's instinct was to refuse. Pride had been beaten into him for so long that even now, broken and disgraced, he wanted to cling to it. But the sincerity in her tone, gentle, almost casual, disarmed him. She wasn't offering charity. She wasn't pitying him. She was simply offering help. His throat tightened. Against his better judgment, he nodded. She gave a small, approving smile and gestured toward the door. The cafe's bell jingled faintly as she pushed it open, ushering him inside. Warmth wrapped around him immediately. The air smelled of roasted coffee beans and fresh pastries, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of the storm. Soft jazz floated from an old speaker in the corner, blending with the murmur of late-night customers scattered at small tables. Drake stood frozen just inside the doorway, dripping water onto the worn floorboards. For a man who had once commanded boardrooms lined with marble, the simplicity of this place felt almost foreign. Wooden chairs, mismatched cushions, handwritten chalkboard menus. It was the kind of cafe that belonged more to memory than to profit. The young woman set her umbrella aside, shaking droplets onto the mat, then glanced back at him. "You should sit. I'll get you something warm." He opened his mouth to protest. He didn't have the right, didn't want to impose, but she was already moving toward the counter. With nothing else to do, Drake lowered himself into a corner booth, the leather seat cracked with age. His body sagged, exhaustion pressing down like a lead weight. A few minutes later, she returned with a steaming mug. The porcelain was chipped, the saucer slightly mismatched, but the smell, rich and comforting, drifted up and settled around him like a blanket. "Here," she said, sliding it across the table. It's nothing fancy, but it does the job." Drake wrapped his hands around the cup, the heat seeping into his frozen fingers. For a moment he just stared at it. He had sipped rare vintages of wine that cost more than this cafe made in a week. He had dined on meals curated by Michelin-starred chefs, flown in from Paris. But none of it had ever felt this necessary.
This grounding? He took a sip.
The coffee was strong, a little bitter, but it was real. And for the first time that night, something in his chest eased. "Better?" she asked, sliding into the seat across from him without waiting for permission. He studied her in the warm light. Her coat was worn thin, the fabric fraying near the cuffs. A name tag pinned to her shirt read Felicia. Her hands, resting lightly on the table, bore faint ink stains, as if she spent time writing or sketching between shifts. She looked ordinary, invisible even, the kind of person the city overlooked every day. And yet she had noticed him. "I didn't catch your name," she prompted gently. Drake hesitated. For weeks the name Drake Cole had been spit out by reporters, torn apart by pundits, mocked by strangers. It felt poisoned now, heavy with scandal. But here, with this stranger who offered nothing but an umbrella and a cup of coffee, he heard himself say, "Drake." No titles.
No explanations.
Just Drake. Felicia nodded as if it were the most natural thing in the world. No widening of the eyes, no gasp of recognition, no hurried questions about stock prices or betrayals. Just quiet acceptance. "Well, Drake," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Sometimes the only thing worse than the rain is standing in it alone. So, you're welcome," he blinked, unsure how to respond. Gratitude felt foreign on his tongue. But as he looked at her, this woman who had given up half her umbrella and a seat in her cafe, he realized something. The empire he had lost, the betrayal that haunted him, the storm that threatened to drown him, it all seemed, for a fleeting moment, a little less crushing. Drake lowered his gaze to the steaming cup between his hands. "Thank you," he said quietly, almost to himself. Felicia didn't reply right away. Instead, she leaned back, watching him with a kind of curiosity that wasn't invasive. Then, as if sensing the weight he carried but choosing not to press, she simply said, "Any time." The storm outside continued to rage, but inside that tiny cafe, Drake felt the first fragile stirrings of warmth, something he hadn't known he was searching for. And though he didn't know it yet, this night, this stranger, and this cup of bitter, imperfect coffee would become the turning point of his life. The rain had stopped by the time Drake finally left the cafe that first night, but something lingered inside him long after he stepped back onto the slick streets. It wasn't just the warmth of the coffee or the comfort of dry air. It was the way Felicia had spoken to him, with no agenda, no expectation, no hidden knife tucked behind a smile. That single encounter gnawed at him in the days that followed. Drake had grown accustomed to people wanting things from him. Investors wanted access to his vision. Politicians wanted his donations. Employees wanted promotions, perks, validation.
Even Cassandra, he clenched his jaw at the thought, had wanted an empire, not a husband.
Every kindness in his world had been transactional. But Felicia hadn't asked for anything. He remembered her steady eyes across the booth, the way she'd slid the chipped mug toward him without hesitation, as if giving warmth to a stranger in the rain was the most obvious thing in the world. It unsettled him. It fascinated him. And so a few nights later, he found himself walking the same rain-washed streets, drawn not by intention, but by instinct. The cafe's golden light glowed like a beacon in the dark. Drake lingered outside for a moment, his hand hovering over the door handle. What am I doing here? The old version of himself would have scoffed at the idea of hiding in a corner cafe, rubbing elbows with night shift workers and students hunched over textbooks. But that man was gone, and for reasons he couldn't explain. This place pulled him in. The bell chimed as he stepped inside. Felicia was at the counter, her hair pulled into a loose ponytail, sleeves rolled up as she wiped down a tray. She glanced up at the sound of the bell, and her lips curved into that same small smile. Not the polite professional smile of a waitress trained to please, but something genuine, unpolished. "You came back?" she said simply. Drake cleared his throat.
"Yeah, thought I'd—"
"Try the coffee again?" "Dangerous choice," she teased lightly. "It hasn't improved since last time." Something unexpected tugged at the corner of his mouth, half amusement, half disbelief that he could still remember how to smile. He slid into the same booth as before, and moments later she brought him another steaming mug. This time he didn't sit in silence. "You own this place?" he asked. Felicia shook her head, setting the mug down. "No, I just work the night shift. Helps pay the bills, keeps me busy." She tilted her head. "Why, do I look like I own it?" He studied her, the frayed cuffs of her shirt, the ink stains near her knuckles. "You look like you care," he said finally. She blinked, caught off guard, then laughed softly.
"That's not what most people notice first." Drake wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into him again.
There was something about the simplicity of her presence that stripped away his defenses. With her, he didn't feel the need to calculate every word or brace for hidden motives. As the minutes passed, they spoke in fragments, about the weather, about her long shifts, about how she sometimes filled empty hours sketching. Drake found himself listening, really listening, not because her words carried strategic value, but because they were hers. And the strangest thing happened. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt human. When he finally stood to leave, Felicia glanced at him with that same unstudied kindness. "See you around, Drake." He walked back into the night, the echo of her voice following him like a thread. Over the next week, he returned twice more. Each time, Felicia treated him with the same quiet warmth, never pushing, never prying. She didn't ask about the empire he'd lost, didn't probe into the scandal splashed across every tabloid. She didn't even mention the headlines playing on the cafe's muted television in the corner. Instead, she asked if he liked his coffee black or with cream. She asked if he'd tried the blueberry muffins before they sold out. She asked if he had a favorite song, then laughed when he admitted he hadn't listened to music for pleasure in years. To Drake, every small question was a revelation. It wasn't the content of her words, it was the intent. She wasn't angling for an investment or trying to impress a billionaire. She was just curious about him, the man, not the name. And though he would never have admitted it out loud, he began to look forward to those nights. The quiet booth, the chipped mug, the woman with steady eyes who spoke to him as if he weren't broken. For a man who had spent his life in a world of sharp edges, it was disarming.
It was dangerous.
And yet, it was the only thing keeping him from drowning. By the fourth visit, Drake caught himself lingering long after his coffee had gone cold. Felicia was sketching in her notebook during a lull, and he found himself watching her pencil dance across the page. There was no strategy in her strokes, no calculated outcome, just creation for the sake of it. "Why do you do that?" he asked suddenly. She glanced up, puzzled. "Do what?" "Draw." He gestured toward the notebook. "What's the point?" Felicia tilted her head, then smiled faintly. "Not everything needs a point, Drake. Sometimes it just makes the world a little brighter."
Even if no one else ever sees it, the words hit him harder than he expected.
For a man who had lived his life chasing bottom lines, the concept of doing something with no measurable return was almost incomprehensible. And yet, watching her tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, he realized she believed it completely. Drake leaned back in the booth, the rain tapping softly against the window beside them. For the first time since his empire crumbled, he wasn't thinking about what he had lost or how to claw his way back. He was simply here, in a quiet cafe, with a woman who didn't care who he used to be. And that, he realized, was more dangerous than any boardroom betrayal. The first time Felicia brought her notebook and spread it across the cafe table, she laughed nervously.
"You're going to think this is ridiculous," she said, flipping past pages filled with doodles of children with violins, half-finished floor plans, and scribbled notes like, "Art room?"
And don't forget snacks. Drake leaned forward, adjusting the notebook so he could see clearly. Ridiculous, he said. Would be ignoring this. Felicia tilted her head, studying him as though waiting for sarcasm. But there was none. He was serious, too serious, in fact. His gaze scanned every detail as if he were preparing to pitch it to a board of directors. "You really think it could work?"
she asked softly. "I don't think," Drake replied. "I know, but it won't happen by chance."
"Dreams like this need structure." Felicia's lips curved in a half-smile. "Structure, huh? That sounds expensive." The cafe was quieter that night. Only a handful of customers lingered, an elderly couple sharing tea near the window, a college student asleep over his laptop, a delivery driver nursing a late sandwich. Outside, Manhattan pulsed with its endless rhythm, but inside the world felt slower, softer. Drake sat in his usual corner booth, a chipped mug before him, steam curling into the air. He had begun to settle into a strange routine, arriving after the dinner rush, staying until closing, leaving with the faintest sense of calm that carried him through the restless hours of the night. Felicia slid into the seat across from him without asking, notebook in hand. She always carried it, pages filled with sketches and scribbled thoughts. Tonight, she placed it on the table and flipped it open to a fresh page. "You ever dream about something so big it scares you?" she asked suddenly, her pencil tapping against the blank paper. Drake blinked at her. He had dreamed of plenty, empires, global markets, legacies etched in stone.
None of them had frightened him. "Not really," he said slowly. "Why?"
Felicia hesitated, chewing lightly on the end of her pencil. Then, with a shrug that seemed more vulnerable than casual, she said, "Because I do. All the time." She began to draw, her lines quick and sure, despite her earlier hesitation. A building took shape, rough, uneven, but alive. A wide doorway, windows with curtains, children scattered across the page, holding paintbrushes, instruments, books. Drake leaned forward, curiosity tugging at him. "What is that?" "It's nothing," she said at first, but her eyes betrayed the spark behind her words.
"Just a dream."
"I've always wanted to create a place for kids, somewhere they could go after school, somewhere safe. A place where they could learn music, art, whatever sparks their imagination. A house for hope." She paused, her gaze drifting down to the sketch. "When I was a kid, we didn't have much.
My mom worked herself into the ground just to keep the lights on. I never had piano lessons or art classes, but once a neighbor gave me a box of broken crayons.
And for weeks, those crayons felt like magic. They made me believe the world was bigger than our tiny apartment, that maybe there was room for something more." Her voice softened, almost embarrassed. "So yeah, if I ever had the chance, I'd build a place like this. Hope House. That's what I call it in my head." The words lingered between them. Drake stared at the page, the crude drawing suddenly more compelling than the glossy blueprints he'd spent his life reviewing. He could see it, not just the lines on the paper, but the life behind them. Children laughing in bright rooms, music spilling into hallways, the scent of paint and possibility. Something tightened in his chest. For years, he had measured dreams in profits and projections. He had built towers of glass and steel, but none of them carried warmth.
None of them made him feel the way this sketch did. "You're serious about this," he said quietly. Felicia gave a small, almost defensive laugh.
"Serious enough to think about it, not serious enough to actually make it happen. I don't have money, connections, or any of the things it would take." She waved the pencil as if to erase the thought. "It's just a silly dream." Drake's gaze didn't waver. "It's not silly." Her eyes flicked to his, surprised by the firmness in his tone. He leaned back, fingers brushing the rim of his coffee cup. "You know what the problem with most dreams is? They're built on ambition, on ego, They're about outshining someone else, proving something, conquering the next mountain. But this, he nodded at the notebook, this isn't about you. It's about giving. That makes it the kind of dream worth chasing. Felicia studied him for a long moment, searching his face for irony or hidden motives. Finding none, she smiled faintly.
You really think so?
I know so. For the first time in months, Drake felt something stir inside him that had nothing to do with reclaiming power or proving himself. It was quiet, uncalculated, and frightening in its purity, the desire to help someone simply because he believed in them. He reached across the table, pulling the notebook closer. Tell me more about Hope House. What would it look like?
How many kids could it hold? What would you need to get started?
Felicia blinked, startled. Why? You don't have to. I want to, he interrupted gently. Her expression softened, a flicker of hope lighting in her eyes. Slowly, she began to talk about classrooms filled with instruments, shelves lined with art supplies, volunteers teaching dance and theatre, a kitchen that served hot meals. As she spoke, the cafe seemed to fade, replaced by the vivid world of her imagination. Drake listened, not as a man calculating return on investment, but as someone rediscovering what it meant to believe in something good. By the time she finished, her cheeks were flushed, her eyes alight with a passion that made her seem almost luminous. She laughed suddenly, embarrassed by her own intensity. Sorry, I get carried away. Drake closed the notebook gently. Don't apologize. Some dreams are worth getting carried away for. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, and in that quiet corner of a modest cafe, Drake Cole, the man who had lost everything, realized he had just found the first glimmer of something greater than wealth, greater than power. He had found a reason to believe again. The first time Felicia brought her notebook and spread it across the cafe table, she laughed nervously. You're going to think this is ridiculous, she said, flipping past pages filled with doodles of children with violins, half-finished floor plans, and scribbled notes like, art room, and don't forget snacks. Drake leaned forward, adjusting the notebook so he could see clearly. Ridiculous, he said, would be ignoring this. Felicia tilted her head, studying him as though waiting for sarcasm. But there was none. He was serious, too serious, in fact. His gaze scanned every detail as if he were preparing to pitch it to a board of directors. You really think it could work? She asked softly. I don't think, Drake replied. I know, but it won't happen by chance. Dreams like this need structure, Felicia's lips curved in a half-smile. Structure, huh? That sounds expensive, Drake chuckled. Not as expensive as running a multinational corporation. Trust me, I've done both the math and the sleepless nights. Something about the ease in his tone, the subtle self-deprecation, made Felicia relax. She slid the notebook closer to him.
Okay then, Mr. Structure, where do we start?
That evening became the first of many. Drake began drawing neat columns in her notebook. Budget, timeline, staffing, permits. He explained how non-profits could apply for grants, how fundraising campaigns could be structured, how local businesses might sponsor supplies. Felicia listened with wide eyes, jotting down every word as if he were revealing a secret language.
You make it sound so possible, she whispered. It is, Drake said.
And he meant it. For years, his expertise had been used to expand empires built on greed. Now, applying the same knowledge to a dream born out of generosity felt almost redemptive. Every line he drew, every calculation he made, it was as if he was reclaiming a part of himself he thought was gone forever. The nights blurred into a rhythm. Felicia brought coffee refills and her boundless imagination. Drake brought spreadsheets on napkins and the sharp clarity of a strategist. One night she described a music room where children could try instruments without fear of breaking them. I want them to feel free, she said, her hands sketching shapes in the air. Drake nodded, already jotting down ideas. We'll need partnerships with schools or maybe music stores willing to donate old instruments. Liability insurance, too. Kids are fearless with drums, Felicia laughed, a warm, easy sound that cut through his meticulous planning. See, that's why I need you. I dream in crayons, you think in contracts. He looked up, meeting her eyes. Together, that's how dreams become real. Her cheeks flushed faintly, but she didn't look away as Hope House took shape on paper. Something else began to take shape between them. Drake found himself watching Felicia when she spoke, drawn to the way her whole face lit up when she described the future. She had none of Cassandra's polish, none of the calculated grace that came from years of climbing social ladders. Felicia was raw, unfiltered, and impossibly genuine. It unnerved him. It healed him. One evening, as he explained the importance of filing for non-profit status, he caught her staring at him with quiet intensity. "What?" he asked, self-conscious. Felicia shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You're different when you talk about this."
Lighter, somehow, Drake frowned.
Lighter? Yeah. When I first met you, you looked like you were carrying the whole city on your shoulders.
But now...
She hesitated, searching for the right words. Now you look like someone who finally set it down. The words pierced him in a way no accusation ever had. Cassandra had always accused him of being too soft, too idealistic, weaknesses she'd said he needed to bury if he wanted to survive. And so he had. He had buried every trace of warmth under steel and strategy, convincing himself love was leverage, trust was currency. But Felicia, she was unearthing something he thought was long dead. Drake looked down at the notebook between them, at the messy sketches now covered in his clean handwriting. "Maybe I needed the storm," he said quietly. Felicia tilted her head. "Storm?" He gave a faint smile, losing everything. Maybe it was the only way I'd stop building the wrong empire. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the hum of the cafe's espresso machine and the muffled jazz playing from the corner. Then Felicia reached across the table, her fingers brushing his lightly as she turned a page in the notebook. "Then let's build the right one," she said softly. Drake swallowed hard, his throat tight. He wasn't sure if she meant Hope House or something larger, something fragile and unnamed between them. But for the first time in years, he wanted to find out by the end of that week. The dream of Hope House was no longer just Felicia's. It had become theirs. And though Drake still carried the scars of betrayal, still felt the echoes of Cassandra's voice telling him he was too naive. Those wounds began to close under the gentle persistence of Felicia's faith. With every plan they drafted, with every possibility they sketched, she wasn't just rebuilding a dream, she was rebuilding him. The cafe had grown quiet again, the late-night crowd thinning until only the hum of the espresso machine and the patter of rain against the windows remained. Felicia sat across from Drake, her pencil lying idle on the notebook between them. They had spent the last hour sketching floor plans for Hope House, but now silence stretched comfortably across the booth. Felicia leaned back, studying him. "You know," she said softly, "for someone who knows so much about building things, you don't talk much about what you've built."
Or what you've lost, Drake's jaw tightened.
For weeks he had avoided it. The past, the betrayal, the headlines that branded him a failure. Here, with Felicia, he had found refuge from all of that. But her words lingered, gentle but insistent, like rain finding its way through cracks in stone. He stared into his coffee, the steam long since faded. "There isn't much worth saying." Felicia tilted her head, waiting. Drake exhaled slowly. "Cassandra."
"My wife," he stopped, the word bitter on his tongue.
"She was never really my wife, not in the way it mattered." Felicia's eyes softened, but she didn't interrupt. "It was a deal," he continued, his voice flat. "Her family had influence, I had ambition. Together we looked unstoppable. Investors trusted a man with a polished wife at his side. The press loved us, a power couple, they called us. But behind closed doors, it was all leverage. She didn't love me. She loved the empire. And when the cracks showed, when I was vulnerable,
His throat tightened.
she left. Worse than that, she took everything she could. He fell silent, the weight of the confession pressing down. Felicia's hands curled lightly around her mug, her expression steady. "That must have hurt," she said simply. The understatement almost made him laugh. Instead, Drake shook his head. "I was a fool.
I thought I was too smart to be used."
Turns out I was just easy to manipulate. Too eager to believe in someone who only saw me as a stepping stone. For a long moment the only sound was the rain outside. Then Felicia spoke, her voice low but clear.
"That doesn't make you foolish."
"It makes you human." Drake lifted his gaze, startled by the conviction in her tone. She hesitated, then pushed the notebook aside, folding her hands on the table. "I know what it's like to feel small, to think you're not enough, or that you don't deserve more than what the world has handed you." She drew a shaky breath. "When I was a kid, my mom worked 3 jobs. Sometimes she'd come home too tired to even eat dinner. My dad wasn't around. Bills piled up, and I learned early that dreams were expensive luxuries we couldn't afford." Her eyes grew distant, lost in memory. "I loved to draw. It was the only thing that made me feel like I could escape. But we couldn't afford sketchbooks or pencils. I used grocery receipts, napkins, whatever I could find. There was this one summer when I begged my mom for an art class. She cried because she wanted to give it to me but couldn't." Felicia's voice wavered, but she steadied it quickly. "That's why I dream about Hope House, because kids like me deserve more than scraps."
"They deserve a chance." Drake's chest tightened as he listened.
Her words carried no bitterness, only quiet determination. She wasn't defined by what she lacked. She was driven by what she wanted to give. He leaned forward, his voice rough. "You deserved more, Felicia." She blinked, startled by the intensity in his tone. "You deserved crayons that weren't broken."
"Classes you didn't have to beg for. A father who stayed." His hand curled into a fist on the table. "You deserved the world, and it failed you." For a moment, Felicia simply stared at him, her eyes shining with something he couldn't name.
Then softly, she said, "Maybe. But if I hadn't lived that life, I wouldn't be here now."
"I wouldn't have this dream, and I wouldn't have met you." The words hung between them, fragile and unspoken. Drake swallowed hard, the lump in his throat impossible to ignore.
He had spent years armoring himself against vulnerability, but with Felicia, the armor cracked. He saw his own scars mirrored in hers, not identical, but familiar. Both of them had been broken by the world in different ways. Both of them carried wounds that still ached. And yet, here they were, sitting across from each other in a small cafe, sketching impossible dreams on paper napkins. Somehow, together, the pain didn't feel as heavy. Drake reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. It wasn't calculated, wasn't planned. It was instinct, raw and unguarded. Felicia didn't pull away. For the first time since Cassandra's betrayal, Drake felt something shift inside him. Not the rush of ambition, not the sting of pride, but something gentler.
Steadier? Hope, and though neither of them said it out loud,
they both knew it. 2 wounded souls had begun to find healing in each other. Hope House began as sketches on napkins and late-night conversations over lukewarm coffee, but within months, those fragile dreams started taking shape in brick and mortar. The first milestone was small. A landlord on the Lower East Side agreed to lease an abandoned community hall for a fraction of its value after hearing Felicia's earnest pitch. Then came the volunteers, retired teachers, local musicians, artists who had once been children with dreams they couldn't afford. Donations trickled in from neighborhood shops, boxes of second-hand books and dusty instruments pulled from attics. And behind it all was Drake, orchestrating the chaos with the precision of a man who once commanded an empire. He drafted contracts, secured permits, negotiated with suppliers. His name, though tarnished in the financial world, still carried weight with city officials who couldn't entirely forget the prodigy he had once been. When the doors of Hope House finally opened one crisp autumn afternoon, the sound of children's laughter filled the halls. Felicia stood in the middle of it all, tears glimmering in her eyes as kids swirled around her, crayons in hand, voices raised in joy. Drake watched her, something tight and unfamiliar pressing in his chest. It wasn't pride in his own work, it was pride in hers, in the way she had turned pain into purpose, scarcity into generosity. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged. The press caught on quickly. Local newspapers ran headlines, "From dreams to reality," "Hope House brings light to the East Side." Photos of smiling children holding paintbrushes and violins spread across social media. Interviews followed, with Felicia shyly explaining the vision, always crediting a friend who knew how to make plans real. Drake stayed out of the spotlight. It was her story, her dream. But even in the shadows, he couldn't escape the attention. Former colleagues whispered about his unexpected resurrection, tabloids speculated about the mysterious woman at his side, and eventually, inevitably, Cassandra found him. She appeared one evening after an open house event, where parents had crowded into the newly painted classrooms to see their children's first clumsy art displays. Felicia was in the back, cleaning up brushes with a group of volunteers. Drake had stepped outside for air, the laughter of children still ringing in his ears when a voice as sharp as broken glass sliced through the night. Well, if it isn't the fallen king, he froze. Slowly, he turned. Cassandra stood under the glow of a street lamp, her designer coat pristine, her posture flawless. Not a hair was out of place, not a hint of remorse in her eyes. She looked as if betrayal had only polished her, not burdened her. "Cassandra," Drake said flatly. She smiled, all teeth and venom.
"I read about this little charity project of yours. Very noble, very
"Quaint." Her gaze flicked toward the building behind him. "But this isn't you, Drake. You were born to command, not to babysit starving artists and orphans." His jaw clenched. "They're children, and they deserve better than the world gave them." Cassandra laughed lightly, dismissive. "You sound like a poet, but you and I both know you're not. You're a strategist."
a leader. This,
She gestured at the building. "This is a phase.
a distraction.
You belong back in the world that matters." Her eyes gleamed, predatory. "And I can take you there. The board is restless without you. Investors would line up if they thought you were back in play. With my connections and your brilliance, we could rebuild bigger, faster. You could have it all again." Drake's breath caught. For a fleeting moment, her words stirred something dangerous inside him. The old hunger, the allure of power, prestige, redemption in the eyes of the world that had mocked him. Cassandra saw it, the flicker of temptation, and pressed closer.
"Come back, Drake. Leave this fantasy behind."
"You don't belong in the gutter with dreamers. You belong at the top, with me." Inside the hall, Felicia laughed at something one of the volunteers said, her voice carrying faintly through the open window. Drake turned toward the sound instinctively, the warmth of it pulling him back from the precipice. But Cassandra's voice slithered in again.
"That girl doesn't understand you."
"She never will. She's small, ordinary. You'll outgrow her, just like you've outgrown everything else." Drake's throat tightened. Felicia's face flashed in his mind, the steady gaze that had seen him in the rain when no one else had looked twice. The way she had believed in Hope House when it was nothing more than a doodle on a napkin, and yet. Cassandra's words lingered, poisonous but persuasive. For the first time since meeting Felicia, Drake felt himself pulled in two directions. When he stepped back inside, Felicia noticed immediately. His shoulders were rigid, his expression shadowed. She asked if everything was okay, but he deflected, claiming he was just tired. Still, the distance settled between them like a ghost. Felicia tried to ignore it, but doubt gnawed at her. Had Cassandra been right? Was Drake only playing at simplicity, waiting until the call of power grew too strong? For the first time, Felicia wondered if the man who had once built empires could ever truly be content with crayons and children's laughter. And for the first time, Drake wasn't sure of the answer himself. The days after Cassandra's reappearance hung heavy between Drake and Felicia. At first, it was subtle, missed eye contact, conversations that trailed off into silence. But Felicia noticed the change in him. The way his thoughts seemed to drift during meetings, the distant look in his eyes when they talked about Hope House. She tried to brush it aside. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe the burden of logistics and planning was wearing on him. But in her heart, unease bloomed. One evening, after the children had gone home and the volunteers had packed up, Felicia found Drake standing alone in the hallway of Hope House. The sound of laughter still lingered faintly in the walls, but he didn't seem to hear it. His gaze was fixed on the floor, shoulders tight, as if he were carrying something he couldn't set down. "Drake," she said softly, stepping closer. "What's going on?" He glanced up, startled, but quickly masked it.
Nothing, just a lot on my mind. Felicia folded her arms. It's her, isn't it?
"Cassandra." The silence that followed was answer enough. Her chest tightened. "She wants you back." Drake's jaw flexed. "She wants power back. She always did." "But you're tempted," Felicia whispered. His breath caught. He opened his mouth to deny it, but the truth clung to his silence. Felicia's throat burned. "I knew this was too good to last. You don't belong here, Drake. Not with me. Not with crayons and paintbrushes. You belong up there." She gestured vaguely toward the glittering skyline outside the window, where people fight for headlines and fortunes.
That's who you are. No, Drake said sharply, stepping forward. That's who I was. This, he gestured toward the building around them.
"This is who I want to be. Then why can't I believe you?" Felicia's voice broke. "Why do I feel like the moment she snaps her fingers you'll walk away?" Drake froze. He didn't know how to answer, because part of him feared the same thing. Cassandra's offer lingered in his mind like a shadow. Redemption, wealth, the chance to rebuild his empire. And yet, every time he looked at Felicia, he felt the weight of something greater than power, something terrifying in its fragility. "I can't compete with that world," Felicia whispered, her eyes shining. "And I won't try, if you still belong to it." "Then maybe you should go." Drake's chest constricted. "Felicia," but she shook her head, stepping back.
I can't be another Cassandra. I can't hold on to someone who's always looking past me.
"If you choose her world, don't come back here." The words shattered him. He reached for her, but she was already gone, slipping out the door into the night. The days that followed were agony. Felicia didn't return his calls. At Hope House, she kept her distance, throwing herself into the children's activities while Drake handled the business side in silence. The warmth that had once bound them had cooled into polite distance, and every glance she avoided cut him deeper. Meanwhile, Cassandra pressed harder. Invitations arrived at his apartment, exclusive galas, private boardroom meetings. Messages promised the swift return of everything he had lost: power, prestige, redemption in the eyes of the world. Drake stood on a knife's edge. On one side was Cassandra's world, glittering, familiar, ruthless. On the other was Felicia, unpolished, fragile, real. One promised power, the other promised love, but love terrified him more than betrayal ever had. Power was predictable.
Love required trust.
And trust was what Cassandra had shattered. One night, Drake found himself standing before a mirror, staring at the man he had become. His suit still fit, his reflection still carried the sharp lines of authority. But his eyes, tired, haunted, belonged to a man who no longer believed in the empire he once worshipped. He closed his eyes and heard Felicia's voice. "Then let's build the right one." When he opened them again, he knew the storm that had destroyed him was nothing compared to the storm waiting inside the choice he had to make. Cassandra's world or Felicia's heart?
Power or love?
Noise or silence? Empire or hope? The decision would not only define who he was, it would decide whether he would ever be whole again. And this time, there would be no middle ground. The night of the gala arrived with the kind of spectacle only Manhattan could deliver. Floodlights swept across the facade of the Metropolitan Grand Hotel, their beams piercing the night sky like searchlights announcing a coronation. Luxury cars rolled up to the carpeted entrance one after another, spilling out politicians, celebrities and tycoons draped in silk and diamonds. Photographers lined the barricades, their cameras flashing in relentless bursts, capturing every smile, every wave, every whispered scandal waiting to be spun into tomorrow's headlines. Drake Cole stood just beyond the glittering doors, his reflection caught in the mirrored glass. His tuxedo was tailored to perfection, his posture flawless, every inch of him molded once more into the man the world had worshipped. But as he adjusted his cufflinks, he felt the weight of the disguise pressing down. Inside, the ballroom shimmered with chandeliers the size of carriages, each crystal refracting light across polished marble floors. Tables were dressed in gold-trimmed linens, champagne fountains bubbled in elaborate cascades, and a string quartet played as if their bows could slice the tension hanging in the air. Drake's arrival did not go unnoticed.
Heads turned.
Whispers spread like fire through dry grass. Is it true?
He's coming back!
Cassandra pulled him back into the game. The king has returned. At the center of it all stood Cassandra. She was breathtaking in a gown of black silk that clung like armor, her diamonds catching every glimmer of the chandeliers. When she saw Drake, her smile sharpened, victorious. She swept toward him with the grace of a queen reclaiming her throne. "You look magnificent," she purred, her hand brushing his arm. "Exactly as you should. Tonight, Drake, we take back the Empire." Drake inclined his head, playing the part. Around them, cameras flashed, investors approached with outstretched hands, and the hum of expectation grew louder. He could feel the world leaning in, waiting for him to confirm what they already believed, that he had chosen power once again. But as Cassandra guided him toward the stage, something caught his eye. At the far end of the room, near the doors where the staff moved in and out, stood Felicia. She wore no gown, no diamonds. Her simple dress was borrowed from one of the volunteers at Hope House, her hair pinned up with quiet care. She looked utterly out of place among the glitter and glass. And yet, to Drake, she was the only real thing in the room. Felicia's eyes met his across the sea of tuxedos and gowns. For a moment, time fractured. Her expression wasn't angry, wasn't pleading. It was simply resigned. She had come not to fight for him, but to witness his choice, to see with her own eyes whether the man she had believed in was still standing beneath the armor. Drake's chest tightened. Cassandra leaned closer, her voice a velvet knife. "They're waiting for you. Tonight you announce your return. Together we'll be unstoppable again, unstoppable." The word echoed through him, hollow and cold. Once it had been everything he craved. Now, standing beneath chandeliers and marble, with Felicia's steady gaze burning into him from across the room, it felt like a chain. The MC's voice rang out. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Drake Cole, the man we've all been waiting for." Applause thundered through the ballroom. The spotlight swung to him, blinding and merciless. Cassandra's hand tightened on his arm, her smile triumphant as she guided him toward the stage. But Drake's eyes never left Felicia's. She didn't move, didn't smile, didn't frown. She simply watched, and in her silence, Drake heard the truth louder than the applause. This was the moment. If he stepped onto that stage, if he spoke the words Cassandra had scripted, he would reclaim everything he had lost: wealth,
influence, redemption in the eyes of the world.
But he would lose the only thing that mattered, the fragile, honest love that had given him a reason to breathe again. He reached the edge of the stage. The crowd hushed in anticipation, 1,000 eyes trained on him. Cassandra stood beside him, her presence radiant, commanding, but in the corner, Felicia remained, quiet, unadorned, and infinitely more powerful than all the chandeliers in the room. Drake's pulse thundered in his ears. He took the microphone for a heartbeat. Silence swallowed the ballroom. Cassandra's smile widened. The crowd leaned forward. Felicia's hands curled tightly at her sides. And Drake Cole, once the youngest CEO on the cover of a financial magazine, now a man standing at the crossroads of power and love, drew in a steady breath. The next words would decide everything. The microphone was heavy in Drake's hand, its polished metal gleaming beneath the chandeliers. For a moment he stood frozen, the weight of 1,000 expectant eyes pressing down on him. Cassandra hovered at his side, her hand grazing his sleeve like a leash disguised as affection. Her smile never wavered, sharp, dazzling, certain. She believed she had already won. "Ladies and gentlemen," Drake began, his voice steady, though his heart hammered in his chest. The crowd hushed instantly. "Tonight, I was invited here to announce my return.
To reclaim my place at the top, alongside the woman who once stood beside me." The room erupted in applause, investors nodding, glasses raised in premature celebration.
Cassandra's smile sharpened, triumphant. She leaned closer, whispering, "That's right, say it. Show them you're mine again." But Drake's gaze drifted to the back of the room. Felicia. Her dress was simple, her posture quiet, but her eyes held the strength of someone who had once known hunger and still chose to give. She stood as if ready to walk away, to accept the inevitable, to leave him to the world of marble and glass where she had never belonged. Drake's throat tightened. He turned back to the microphone, but the single word sliced through the applause, silencing the room like a blade. Cassandra stiffened, her grip tightening on his sleeve. Drake's voice deepened. "But I've learned something since the night I lost everything. Power without love is hollow. Success without sincerity is failure.
And wealth without trust is nothing." Gasps rippled through the crowd.
Murmurs rose, investors exchanging bewildered looks. Cassandra's nails dug into his arm, her voice a hiss, meant only for him. "What are you doing?" Drake pulled his arm free, stepping forward. "The truth is, I don't want an empire built on betrayal. I don't want a throne built on fear."
"I don't want Cassandra Hale." A collective shock rippled across the ballroom.
Cassandra's smile faltered, cracks forming in the mask she wore so flawlessly. Drake lifted his chin, his voice resonating through the room. "What I do want is simple.
I want to build something real.
Something that lasts, not towers of glass, but a house of hope. A place for children, for dreams, for second chances. And I want to build it with the only woman who's ever looked at me and seen a man instead of a fortune." His eyes found Felicia's across the room. The crowd turned to follow his gaze. Felicia froze, her breath caught in her chest, her heart pounding louder than the string quartet that had gone silent in stunned disbelief. Drake's words rang out, unwavering. "Felicia Miller, you are my choice. Tonight, tomorrow, always." The silence broke into chaos. Reporters scrambled for cameras, investors muttered in outrage, and whispers swirled like wildfire. Cassandra stood rigid, her face pale beneath the chandelier light. "You fool!" she spat, her composure unraveling. "Do you think they'll still respect you after this? Do you think the world forgives weakness?" Drake turned to her, his voice calm, almost pitying.
"No, Cassandra. I don't need the world to forgive me. I only needed to forgive myself. And I just did." Cassandra's mask shattered.
Rage twisted her elegant features, her voice rising above the murmurs. "You'll regret this."
You'll crawl back when she leaves you, when your little charity collapses under its own weight.
But the words rang hollow. No one applauded her now. No one reached for her hand. She was alone, her empire of manipulation crumbling as surely as his old one had. With a final, humiliated glare, Cassandra turned on her heel and stormed out of the ballroom, her heels striking the marble floor like a war drum retreat. All eyes returned to Drake. He didn't hesitate. He set the microphone down with finality and descended the stage. The crowd parted as he moved, their whispers a storm he no longer feared. Every step carried him closer to the woman who had saved him without even trying. Felicia stood frozen, tears brimming in her eyes, her hands trembling as if unsure whether to reach for him or to run. When he stopped before her, Drake took her hand gently, grounding her. "Felicia," he said softly but loud enough for the room to hear, "you pulled me out of the rain when I was nothing. You gave me hope when I had none. Tonight, I'm telling the world what I should have told you from the beginning. You are my future." Felicia's breath caught, a tear slipping down her cheek. For a moment she searched his face, looking for hesitation, for doubt, but she found none, only truth, raw and unshakable. Her lips curved into the faintest smile as she whispered, "Then let's build it, together, the ballroom."
Stunned into silence, erupted in applause, not the calculated,
Hollow applause of investors, but the genuine kind.
scattered and rising from unexpected corners.
Some clapped out of admiration, some out of awe, some simply because they had witnessed something rare, a man choosing love over power in a world that worshipped both. Drake drew Felicia into his arms, holding her close as the storm of voices swirled around them. For the first time since his empire crumbled, he wasn't afraid of the world watching, because he had nothing left to prove and everything left to live for. 1 year later, Manhattan looked the same as it always had, towers of glass scraping the clouds, neon lights buzzing through the night, traffic weaving endlessly like a living organism. But for Drake Cole, the city no longer looked like a battlefield. It looked like a canvas. Hope House had become more than a single renovated hall. What started as doodles in Felicia's sketchbook had spread into something far greater than either of them had imagined. The original building on the Lower East Side now buzzed with life daily. Children spilled into classrooms after school, filling the air with laughter and music. There was a room lined with shelves of donated books, where volunteers read stories to wide-eyed little ones. Another room brimmed with paintbrushes, sketch pads, and clay, the walls covered in colorful murals painted by the children themselves. The music room echoed with the sound of violins slightly out of tune, drums beaten with abandon, and voices singing freely, unafraid of mistakes. But Hope House was no longer just one building. Local businesses, inspired by the transformation, began donating resources to open satellite centers in other neighborhoods. Churches offered their basements for weekend programs, while retired professionals volunteered their expertise. Within a year, Hope House had grown into a network of community centers, each one carrying the same mission: to give children a safe space to dream. At the center of it all was Felicia. Reporters, drawn by the unlikely success story, now wrote about her with admiration. "The Heart of Hope House," one headline read, beneath a photo of Felicia crouched beside a little girl, proudly holding up her first painting. She blushed when she saw it, muttering that she wasn't used to being in the spotlight. But Drake had smiled quietly, knowing the title was more than accurate, because Felicia was the heart. She was the reason children felt safe when they stepped through the doors, the reason parents trusted the program, the reason volunteers returned week after week. Her kindness, once unnoticed in the shadows of a rainy street, now radiated across an entire city. Drake often stood at the edge of the classrooms, watching her in motion, guiding a child's brushstroke, kneeling to tie a shoelace, laughing with volunteers as they sorted through donated supplies. And every time he felt the same tightness in his chest, the same quiet awe. This was what he had been searching for all along. Not numbers on a balance sheet, not applause from investors, not towers of steel. Meaning, Hope House gave his life meaning again. One afternoon, Drake found himself in the office they had carved out in the back of the original building. It was a modest space, the desk piled with papers, children's artwork taped to the walls. Nothing about it resembled the sleek, sterile boardrooms where he had once spent his days. And yet, as he reviewed proposals for new centers in Brooklyn and Queens, he realized he had never felt more purposeful. Felicia entered quietly, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She set one on his desk with a smile. "You've been at this all day," Drake leaned back, accepting the mug. "Expansion takes planning." Her lips quirked.
Of course it does.
"Good thing I know someone who thrives on planning," he chuckled, shaking his head. "I used to think planning was only about growth and profit margins. Now it's about how many kids we can reach, how many families we can help."
It feels different. Felicia's gaze softened.
"That's because it matters." He studied her for a long moment, then reached across the desk, taking her hand in his. "You know this is your legacy, Felicia. Hope House exists because of you." She squeezed his hand lightly. "Because of us.
I might have dreamed it, Drake, but you made it real.
We built this together." The words warmed him more than the coffee ever could. For years, he had built empires alone, always surrounded but never supported. With Felicia, everything was different. She was not a partner in profit, but in purpose. That weekend, Hope House hosted its first anniversary celebration. Families crowded into the main hall, children rushing to show off paintings and songs they had prepared. Volunteers decorated the walls with balloons and banners, while the kitchen served enough food to feed half the neighborhood. Felicia moved gracefully through the crowd, laughing as she accepted hugs and flowers from grateful parents. A mother pressed her hands together, tears in her eyes, as she thanked Felicia for giving her son a place to belong. Felicia blushed, shaking her head. "He did the work. We just gave him crayons." Drake watched from the edge of the room, pride swelling in his chest. When the speeches began, the MC introduced Felicia as the founder of Hope House. The crowd erupted in applause, chants of her name echoing off the walls. Felicia stepped to the microphone, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger as she spoke. "I was just a girl with a box of broken crayons once," she said, "and I thought dreams were only for people wealthier, luckier, stronger than me. But standing here today, I realize something. Dreams aren't meant to stay locked inside notebooks. They're meant to be shared. And when they are, they become bigger than one person. They become hope." The crowd roared, and Drake's heart clenched. In that moment, watching her shine not because of diamonds or gowns, but because of her truth, Drake knew he had never been prouder of anything or anyone in his life. The man who once ruled skyscrapers had finally found his kingdom, not in power, not in wealth, but in purpose. And at its center was Felicia, the woman who had taught him what it meant to be whole again. The cafe hadn't changed much in a year. The bell above the door still jingled with the same faint cheer. The wooden floors still creaked in familiar places. The chalkboard menu still listed coffee blends and pastries in scrawled handwriting that leaned more whimsical than professional. But for Drake, stepping inside now was like walking into the moment that had altered his life forever. It was here that Felicia had first found him, drenched, broken and invisible to the rest of the city. It was here that she had handed him a chipped mug of coffee and offered something more valuable than sympathy, sincerity. Tonight, the cafe was closed to customers. The lights glowed warmly, the tables pushed aside to create space in the center. Felicia looked around with a small smile, nostalgia softening her features.
"Feels strange being back here like this," she murmured.
So much has changed. Drake reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. Everything changed here.
This is where you saved me, she laughed lightly, shaking her head. I didn't save you, Drake. You saved yourself. He studied her, the woman who had become his anchor, his partner, his heart.
The truth pressed against his ribs, insistent. He had planned this for weeks. But in this moment, he realized no grand stage, no glittering ballroom could compare to the intimacy of this place. He dropped to one knee. Felicia froze, her eyes widening as her breath caught in her throat. "Felicia Miller?" Drake said, his voice thick but steady. "The night you offered me a seat in this cafe, I had nothing left. You gave me coffee, but more than that, you gave me hope. You reminded me that trust and love are not transactions, that they are gifts. Because of you, I found meaning again. Because of you, I found myself again." He opened the small, velvet box, revealing a simple ring, a band of gold with a single diamond, elegant but unpretentious. "I don't need empires.
I don't need towers of glass.
All I need is you. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Felicia's eyes. For a moment, she could only stare at him, her hands trembling. Then she let out a shaky laugh, covering her mouth with one hand as the other reached toward him. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, her voice breaking with joy. "Yes, Drake. 1,000 times yes." Drake slipped the ring onto her finger, his chest aching with a happiness so fierce it felt like light breaking through years of storm. He rose to his feet, pulling her into his arms, their laughter mingling with tears as they held on to each other in the place where it had all begun. The wedding was nothing like the society galas Cassandra had once orchestrated. There were no crystal chandeliers, no diamond-studded gowns, no paparazzi lurking outside velvet ropes. Instead, it was held in the courtyard of Hope House. The walls were decorated with murals painted by the children, bursts of color forming a backdrop more beautiful than any cathedral. Strings of lights hung overhead, twinkling like captured stars. The music was provided by the children themselves, shy violinists, bold drummers, and a choir of young voices singing off-key but with all their hearts. Felicia walked down an aisle lined with paper flowers crafted by little hands. Her dress was simple, ivory lace borrowed from a friend, her hair adorned with a crown of wildflowers picked from a community garden. Drake stood waiting, his suit modest, but his eyes alight with something no fortune could buy. When she reached him, he took her hands, his voice carrying not just to the guests, but to every child and parent who had gathered to celebrate. "I once thought love was a contract," he said, "that it was built on gain, on strategy, on appearances. I was wrong.
Love is trust. Love is kindness. Love is standing in the rain with someone and choosing to stay." Felicia's eyes brimmed as she whispered, "And hope is believing in tomorrow. Even when today is hard," the officiant smiled warmly.
"Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Drake leaned forward, pressing his lips to Felicia's as cheers erupted around them, children clapping, parents wiping tears, volunteers raising their glasses in celebration. It was not the applause of investors. It was not the roar of headlines. It was something infinitely greater, the sound of community.
Of love, of belonging, as twilight deepened into night.
Drake and Felicia stood hand in hand, watching the children dance beneath the strings of lights. Felicia leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly. "The old life?" Drake thought of skyscrapers and boardrooms, of glittering galas and hollow victories. Then he looked at the courtyard filled with laughter, at the ring glinting on Felicia's hand, at the murals painted in joy instead of ambition. "Not for a second," he murmured. Felicia smiled, her eyes closing as she savored the moment. Drake tightened his hold on her. the truth resonating deep in his chest. Sometimes losing everything wasn't the end. It was the beginning, because true love, unlike power, unlike wealth, was something no one could ever take away. Final message: losing everything is not the end. It's the chance to find true love. A love that can never be bought or sold, only given freely.